Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the January 26th, 2023, Season 3, Episode 3 of Ask Us, a web show for the clinical trials community. I'm Jean Smart, the host of Ask Us, and I would like at this time to acknowledge that our broadcast today extends across many Indigenous lands and territories throughout British Columbia. We acknowledge with respect and humility that our Vancouver offices are located in the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations. Our producer today is Nando. Hi, Nan.
Hi, everyone.
Our topic and theme today is archiving clinical trials. And the Ask Us overriding question is, what do we need to know about archiving clinical trials? Well, from the audience response and all your questions, I'd say quite a lot. Archiving is the process and practice of storing knowledge safely and firmly for future use. The change that inspired this topic was, for sure, the Health Canada initiative that has reduced the period for keeping clinical trial records for drugs and natural health products. And it went from 25 to 15 years. This change reflects the amendments to the food and drug regulations and natural health product regulations. And the amendments came into force pertaining to records on February 15th last year, almost a year ago. And previously, clinical trial sponsors had to keep clinical trial records for the full 25 years. This new shorter period reflects their concerns about the cost, the administrative burden, and the requirement that's been placed on them. So technically, by GCP, the periods for keeping records starts at the date the record was created. To simplify the process, most of us choose to start the clock for keeping records when the trial is completed and terminated. The requirement to keep records for 15 years applies to clinical trials of all drugs, natural health products, and ongoing record retention obligations to February the 11th, 2022, and also anything new after February 11th, 2022. So the 15-year thing applies all the way back. It's rare that access to clinical trial records are accessed after 15 years, but sometimes the need arises because of safety issues. There are some examples of that. The new 15-year period more closely aligns with our international regulatory partners, those of Access, that's the name of that organization. And by reducing the burden to sponsors and aligning internationally, Canada will be a more favorable location for conducting clinical trials. So with this change, we've been flooded with archiving questions in the last year, and we've heard many interesting and perplexing examples of what's been raised by this archiving topic. So in this hour, we're going to explore the finer parts of archiving in several subtopic areas. And I brought you the experts. And with that, I'm going to introduce you to my guest panel today. First panelist is Karen McGillivray, the quality lead, Provincial Clinical Trials at BC Cancer. She's the quality lead responsible for quality oversight at 6 provincial centers. She has over 15 years of experience in clinical quality and has previously worked for both the sponsor company, which is very handy today, and a CRO, allowing for a very well-rounded view of good clinical practices. Karen specializes in quality management and SOP creation, and she's conducted GCP audits both domestically and internationally. And she's an accredited GCP specialist with Quality Assurance Society. Welcome, Karen. And Tara Martin is the clinical research manager for MS&NMO at UBC. Tara Martin's a research manager with a lot of experience and accumulated over 20 years. She's been conducting and overseeing clinical research studies. She's an ACRP certified coordinator and has a bachelor's degree in biopsychology from UBC. Tara is highly skilled in project and team management and currently manages 12 research professionals. Of course, Tara's committed to advancing medical treatments, improving patient outcomes, and improving archiving. Gurm Dhugga is the Associate Director of Research and Digital Technology at the Faculty of Medicine, UBC. I am so glad he's here today because you sent in a lot of questions for Gurm. Gurm is a senior IT leader with extensive experience supporting health research. He works collaboratively with researchers to understand and develop digital infrastructure that meets the broad needs, and he's great at explaining things. Gurm has led the development of a digital service portfolio. He had to explain to me what that was, and explaining high performance computing, clinical research systems, data management, application development, and integration. He has significant experience working collaborative with PHSA, the university, and in supporting research and education mission of UBC faculty. His education is comes second to his experience. He has amazing background in technical training and computer networking systems, the Institute of Technology, and a master's in business administration. So his extensive background in education with his extensive experience sits well with us for this presentation today and always. And Tatiana Kawakami is the new Privacy and Policy Advisor at Providence Healthcare. She holds a dual role, and she is an ACRP certified clinical research manager, and she has a background also in medical device. Her experience spans almost every continent except for Antarctica. Her experience is very hands-on, data acquisition to establishing operational quality management processes. She's committed to a patient-centered, very ethical and regulatory compliant approach with research volunteers and research professionals. So we're glad to have Tatiana here. Welcome to all of you. Okay. We're gonna move right into the discussion period, and I'd like to thank all of you who sent these great questions in. These panelists will not be silent. They might banter with each other a little bit, or maybe even disagree. I'm not sure. We'll see how it goes. We're going to start off with a question that came in that's about regulation. It seems like a good place to start. And the question is, who is responsible for the archive? And I'm going to direct that one over to Tatiana to start us off.
Thanks, team. Well, the overall responsibility for the trial conduct, as regulations stipulate, lies with the sponsor. However, the sponsor may elect to transfer some of their responsibilities, and the transfer of responsibilities should always be documented. So for what it means for investigative sites is to have this type of documentation embedded in the contractual agreements. It's always good to have some sort of responsibilities checklist that will further provide responsibilities and transfer of obligations. So yes, start planning the study closeout activities and archiving at the very beginning. Initiate this conversation with the sponsors. Not only it will have regulatory obligation, it also has some of the budgetary implications as well. Yes, the retention period has been reduced to 15 years, but there could be other factors that come into play that will require sponsors to legally hold the records for a longer period of time. So all of this should be discussed at the very beginning and documented in the contract. Some of the sponsors, of course, are open to negotiating and paying for some, or hopefully for all of the costs for keeping the archives.
Great answer, great points.
I'll jump in here and remind everyone that the archive is not strictly limited to your either trial master file or your investigator site file. From a site perspective, there's also those source documents that you have on your clinical trial participants. Those will never get transferred back to the sponsor. They are the responsibility of that site investigator. So those would be included in your archive as well.
Great point.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. And for the sponsor investigator, you brought on an excellent point. So yes, for investigator-initiated studies, the responsibility for keeping the archive would lie with investigators. So it's always a great idea not only to plan for this financially, but also to consult with institutional policies on document and record retention when the time comes for the archives to be pulled. And this way you would know what to do with the documents.
Great. Okay, let's move along to talk about archive process. I think we had a lot of questions on what contents should actually be in the clinical trial archive. And I'm gonna turn over to our expert here, Tara.
Thank you. I feel weird being called an expert. I've done a lot of archiving, thankfully, in my last position. So thank you to Chaos for that opportunity.
You're silent, Tara. You went mic.
Thank you. Yeah, just saying, not quite an expert, but I have a lot of experience from my last role in archiving at Chaos, and I'm really grateful for that opportunity archiving project that we did there. Just wanted to shout out to them. And Tatiana, totally agree with you. I'm just nodding my head up and down. Awesome content. In terms of what you need to archive, you basically have to archive everything to reconstruct your trial. So as long as if you've screened one patient, then you have to archive everything that you've done before, during, and after the study, all of your essential documents. And those essential documents are well outlined and listed in the ICH guidelines under E6R2 section 8. It's about 15 pages. So I recommend going through, reading it, just, making sure you know all your content. When you get your trial master file, you have good content there from the sponsors. If it's an industry sponsored study, it'll list out like your protocol, your IB, all of your logs, your screening, your enrollment, your deviation logs, your correspondence, your financials, everything that you do on your study from the beginning to the end. The thing that happens sometimes is that parts of this may not be complete. They belong at different places. So you should always have a document locator or a note to file to mention, like, your archives with your pharmacy, for example, are held in the pharmacy department by, so-and-so at this address, the location of those documents if the files are not fully complete. So I do recommend that you have a document locator for anything that might be missing. Your CVs, perhaps you're going to put those on media and they're not going to be on paper with your paper content. So to just outline where those things are. And in terms of like the minimum amount you need to file, then that would be pretty much everything. I do recommend that if you have the time, to make sure that you're not putting in duplicate protocols, duplicate brochures, weed that stuff out, make sure that you're just putting one of everything that you need to, so that you're not bulking up your content.
Great answer. On the same archive process theme, what process do you use for archive of a database for a qualified investigator-initiated study? And I'm looking at Gurm to answer that.
Thanks, Jean. Good question. So I'll touch on a little bit about, in my current role at Faculty of Medicine, what our process is, and I'll speak to it a bit more generally after that. So at Faculty of Medicine, we are providing electronic data capture platform that has the capability of archiving a project. The key components of archiving are preparing the database and then storing it for long term. So in terms of preparing the database, and this is very critical, is to ensure that the ability to modify the database has been removed and end user access has been removed so that it can stay in a state at the closure of the trial. And all of the steps associated with archiving are captured in an audit log, and all of those can be traced on what were the steps taken, and then in the faculty medicine system, the the data can be kept there for a period of 15 years or longer if need be. And we also have a very detailed standard operating procedure that describes all of the steps that are required for starting with initiating the archive to how the data management team completes it. So in general, I would say if you are going to be involved in a trial and responsible for one, first at the onset, as other colleagues pointed out, consult with the professional, consult with your IT team at your local institution, and consider the key components, which are preparing the database for archiving, and that includes implementing technical controls so the state of the database is not compromised over its time, and then finding a proper electronic or physical digital media to store it that would be considered reliable for a period of the compliance period, 15 years. So.
Okay, I have a similar question, but not quite the same. So not the database. That was great, by the way. What about the recommendations around archiving other types of electronic data that are part of the clinical trial, the records, some of the records? So like CDs and USBs and cloud software, like what are your recommendations around that part of it?
So those are all valid medias to archive electronic data. However, with the nuance, they're not all created equally. So please stay away from a thumb drive you got at a conference for free to archive any data. So the levels of products in all of those are very, very different. So again, check with your institutional IT and get recommendations from them. So optical media like CDs, DVDs have a limited lifespan. There is M-Disc as the latest one, which people claim are for 1,000 years. And then consider with physical media, there is the chances of flood, theft, fire. So you do have to maintain its physical security for a period of time. And this is where I think cloud storage or your institutional storage is also very much a value add as we see cost of storage really decreasing. These are very good options to consider for long-term storage. And in most institutions, in the next year or 18 months, we're going to see cloud rollout. So that will be another option. So again, check with your local IT professionals.
I saw the quality group here nodding and raising their eyebrows the whole time you were talking, Gurm. So apparently they love your answer. Okay, so let's swing over to quality for a minute. How do you create a standalone archive that explains a complete picture of what occurred during a clinical trial? Maybe I'll let Karen hit that one.
Something to keep in mind when you are archiving your trial is that an auditor in 10 years, when you are no longer in your role, should be able to open your boxes or open that archive and be able to go through and understand the trial without you having to be there. It can be hard to do when you have had a trial for its entire life and you know everything about what happened to the documentation, the decisions that were made, the journey of the participants through the trial, but consider that you're not going to be there. What you may have to do is create some documentation to explain the events of your trial. Some people know this as storyboarding. Some people might know this as an issue summary. It will map out the events, the decisions, like I said, the journey of your participants through your trial, so that if anyone does need to open that archive, they have everything they need to understand the events of the trial. What you can also do is if you read section 8.1 of ICH E6 R2, perhaps not many of you have read it to this depth, but it does provide you the option of either adding or subtracting documents as your trial may require from that essential document list. This is something that you want to do at the start of the study rather than at the end. It should be something that you plan out rather than something that you look through and go, oh, I'm missing some stuff. Let's just write a memo. That can also help explain the trial and how it unfolded.
I love that answer. Tara, you have something to add to that?
I'm just like thinking like an issue summary is like a red flag for an auditor to go, okay, I'm gonna start here. Like, how do you define like what you put in there? For
I
your-
wouldn't call it, I just title it different.
Yeah, title it differently. That's why I like to use the word storyboard.
Yeah.
It's a bit more auditor friendly for sure, and it would also be more encompassing of the trial itself rather than just focusing on, like you said, those red flags. So thank you for that.
So a great example of this is the pandemic, where we had stops and starts, and Gurm had to go and lock things down temporarily, and Tatiana had a million regulatory questions, and the heavy lifting from quality and operations. So that's a great thing to have to storyboard, is what happened to our trial during the pandemic. Okay, I'm going to still stay in the quality zone, but I'm going to ask a different question. What do you think is the ideal process for selection of an archive service? And maybe Tatiana and Gurm want to try that on for size.
Sure. Vendor selection. It's a mandatory requirement, and not just vendor selection, but also vendor surveillance and continuous management. So again, all of this should be thought through at the very beginning. And the question of convenience versus quality is always an important one. Just because it's convenient to drop off the archiving packages somewhere close by doesn't necessarily mean that this vendor will provide the quality service, right? So whoever is responsible for selecting the vendor for archiving should ensure that they have a suitable business continuity plan and disaster recovery, that their facilities adhere to the proper storage conditions, and then they have enough staff to manage the retrieval should this be required. Also important, and I'm sure Gurm will touch upon this whenever we're talking about electronic vendor for the document storage, ensure that they have proper security and privacy assessments done as well.
Gurm, would you like to add to that?
Absolutely. I think Tatiana covered it. I think starting right from the vendor selection, you're looking at, in these instances, a long period of time to be have a reliable service, especially in technology. There are a lot of fly-by-night vendors that come and go. You want to ensure that vendors going to be around. So looking at it, the reputation, the longevity of a vendor, how long have they been in the business, and your best allies are your procurement partners in your institution to work with. For example, UBC health authorities have qualified vendor lists that you can look at. So start there. The second consideration, as Tatiana touched on, do they have a safe and secure environment? Are they certified for electronic document storage or physical document storage? Do they have the appropriate certifications? Do they have the controls? And again, if you're unsure, check with your procurement partner, check with your local IT organization. In most cases, those are similar vendors that your institution may already be using.
I might add also, Gurm doesn't love me these days when I call him and tell him that we opened an archive and there's a floppy disk inside. So the vendor also needs to have the technology to support the type of electronic data that you have put into their care. So, and that's happening a lot these days. So those of you that don't know what a floppy disk is, I'm going to let you talk to Gurm about that.
I really hope we don't still have floppy disk, but I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah, we found a few recently. Okay, tracking. What are the challenges of the master tracker? This is for an institute or program or center, and managing the archive records of all the studies. And I think these are like the ghosts of archive, past, present, and future. Does anybody feel comfortable tackling that? Tara or Karen, maybe?
Karen, did you want to go ahead, or are you? I'm happy.
Sure, I can lead off.
Okay.
So a master tracker, and I do very much hope that your institution has one, should be your master list of all the trials and all the documentation sets that you have archived. It should list out all the specifics that you need about the trial, who the QI or PI was, the dates that it was archived, the number of boxes, or the number of, say, units that were archived, where that archive is, how long it's been there, etc. This should be maintained centrally, and you should always have someone who knows where it is, how to access it. Hopefully, if it's password protected, they have said password. One of the biggest challenges is simply having someone who knows what it is, where it is, and how to actually use it. That's what I found.
Tara, you have a lot of experience doing this with a lot of studies.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. I totally agree with you. The main issue, I think, with a lot of smaller companies or organizations is not having one. So really getting one together, if you don't have a master tracker in the beginning, I feel like a lot of us are working in silos. We've got one study coordinator, one PI, we're all doing our thing. We archive it, we put it away. We've got different content. So a lot of the content may be incomplete for somebody's packaging than another. So getting a master tracker and getting those main elements that Karen mentioned, you know, which box, what content's in it, what type of content, is it regulatory, is it patient data, that sort of thing. Is there media in this box? That sort of thing as well. It's important to just make a master tracker, as well as maybe the present, the past, and the future. Like I had a tracker when I was doing the archiving project at Chaos, where we had the first tab would have all of the content that was offsite transferred to UBC Park Library or Iron Mountain, wherever it may be. And the second tab would be the ones that were transferred to an investigator or such, so we know where everything is. The third tab would be those coming up for destruction or for retention. And another tracker could be the ones coming this year that are the studies that are going to close, and you're going to package and archive. So you can have the different stages on your tracker as well. So you can even expand it out. And I highly recommend, as Karen said, just have one person at least dedicated to be overseeing everything for your organization. It really helps that one person has that site oversight, and meet once a year with your group and make sure that they know, they tell you when projects are ending so you can put them on your tracker.
This arguably falls between administration and IT and technology, because remember, don't forget just the I part of information and technology. So I think it's a collaborative for some of the larger groups, and I think we forget that sometimes. So that's a big point in other countries where IT is the one that looks after the archive. So, okay, now let's talk about what happens when we open an archive. In what instances would you open a box or visit an electronic archive? And when you do so, how do you document that you were in there and messing around?
Well, as much as as much as some of my oddities feel like I am messing around, the most common instances that you are pulling boxes back from archive or going into an electronic archive are either an audit, Health Canada or other regulatory inspection. You may also be looking at your archives because of suspected damage, floods, fires, pests, the deterioration of, those ECG papers, that's pretty common. You may also be in the practice of checking up on your archives, just to see how they are faring over the years, or you may be transferring your media for a different type of archive storage.
Is
but
that
like-
if Gurm finds a floppy disk?
That's if Gurm finds a floppy disk or one of those bigger zip disks, I think. I remember those. But your most common is probably going to be audit or inspection. Something to keep in mind that when you pull a box back or when you open an archive, you have to document that. It needs to be documented who went in, when they went in, what they looked at, what they pulled. And it also needs to be documented that whatever was pulled or looked at has been returned to that box. We see this fairly often, especially as Cerner comes along, as paper charts are transferred into Cerner and then sent off site. Sometimes we actually do need to pull those paper charts back. It's not always an easy process, especially going through multiple layers to get the chart, but it is happening a bit more and more these days.
Anybody like to add to that? Gurm, Karen?
Sure. Yeah, I think Karen touched on all of the things. I think suspected damage is a component where, whether it's at the institution, floods happen, things happen, or whether it's through a service provider, that if there are cases of that, you want to ensure that your archive is in still in good state. So again, first and foremost, those archives should have technical control, so you can't write to it. So even if you open it, it's in its current state. It's perhaps not today, but in the future, we might have institution changing cloud vendors, and as institutions secure better deals. So there will be a case in the future where your IT organization might change vendors. And in those instances, it's very important to work with your IT team to know what are their procedures for validating that the transfer has occurred safely and securely, what are their processes, and then you can take those and add to your source material, so you know that if a vendor change, the things are still in good condition.
Great answer.
I wanted to add to what Karen kind of touched upon about this periodic review sort of process. I think that, like at my last organization, we had a nice SOP established. We organized our archives, we got in a good condition. We decided early on that we are going to do a periodic review. We're going to pull, for 25 years, it's a long time. We're going to set some time points where we are going to pull random boxes. We said 10% of the boxes would be retrieved. We would look through those for physical integrity, make sure security wise, make sure content wise, everything was correct. We had a checklist of kind of what we would look for. Now that the period is shortened, maybe a less often needed periodic review, but I think that it's important, as Karen said, to maybe consider putting that into your SOP so that you can ensure that your media is still intact and has integrity. And what I made was an emergency medical or sort of medical IT box where we had like the technology, the little computer with the drive for the CD and everything to read, so that we had like an emergency IT kit for anything media that we pulled. And we always put our media in the very first box, so that we would always pull the first box and then whatever other boxes we wanted, just for a little tip.
Ah. Okay. So on that note, so we all say we open the box and we find some of those things that Gurm doesn't want in there. Can you transfer medium for an old archive or midway through an archive at the time of archive? Gurm, do you want to comment on that?
Sure. I think so. One of the most common ones we see now, and something people come to IT, is digitization of paper records. So that's one of the more common ones, and in most cases, your institution should have a records management policy, and if in addition to a digitization standard. So in case of UBC has a digitization standard. The key component that you want to know about is it's not just I did it, it's witnessed, you had a process that you followed, that you documented, and that you had somebody attest to the quality after it's been transferred, whether it's been transferred from one media to another or from paper to electronic, that you have somebody attest to the quality of it, that it's intact and it's verified. And all of that needs to be documented. So check with your institution standards and ensure that that it's not somebody, you know, you're not hiring a student for a period of 3 months just to do this on his own. And because if there's quality issues, that's a real risk.
So even though we've archived, we're creating more documentation, you know, got that right, everybody? Okay. Would you dare even archive now without talking to IT? Okay, compliance. So there's a compliance question here. What are the common or new observations or findings related to archive? I'm going straight for Karen here.
It may surprise you to know that archiving has risen in the ranks of common audit findings or inspection findings. And like Jean mentioned earlier, a lot of it has to do with the pandemic. Trials halted and restarted or were closed altogether. And oftentimes the archives were pretty inadequate. Folders and documents were just chucked in a box and put off site or put into storage. And when the auditors have come back around, they've not been able to make heads or tails of what happened in the trial. So just like the auditor should be able to understand the events of the trial as the trial is going on, like we said before, the archive should be the same state with or without the trial staff there to explain everything. So we've been seeing a lot of observations on inadequate archives, either not enough documentation to reconstruct the trial and to demonstrate the quality of the data and the rights and the safety of the participants. There's also been findings on inadequate archives in that not much documentation is present at all, either from the TMF or ISF components or from the source documentation.
That's a little concerning, isn't it? So great that we're having this session today. All right. Okay, now moving on to the really scary topic, the D topic, destruction. Okay, regulatory burden has lessened the time frame, as we talked about. So who actually has the authority to decide when you can destroy documents, and should you? And if so, everything? So I'm going to let you guys go to task on this one. How about Tatiana? Let's start with you.
Oh, that's
You've been very quiet.
it's a very complex and loaded question. The short answer, it depends. It depends what type of materials, what documents we're talking about. Ideally, even before one gets to the destruction stage, there should be documented processes that identify how materials to be destroyed will be tracked and identified, how the destruction will take place, who is responsible for the destruction, how do you obtain the approval for the destruction. So again, ideally, this should be an SOP that's created before you actually lay your hands on it. In terms of different types of documents, again, although responsibility does fall on sponsor, and sponsor is responsible ultimately for giving the approval for the destruction of the material. When we talk about investigator site level documents, investigator should also be approving the destruction before it happens. Now, because we're talking, 15 years from now at best, there could be an exceptional circumstance where neither the sponsor nor the investigator can be reached. In such cases, Jean, you've already mentioned, when we destroy documents, we actually create more documentation, and this is true because all the attempts to contact the sponsor and the investigator, or if it's known that one of them won't be available, should be documented. And this record should be retained before any destruction takes place. Yeah, that's, I hope that covers a little bit.
A bit of it. How about quality and IT?
I'll jump in a little bit. As much as you might want to, the destruction does not mean you can have a bonfire in the parking lot.
Yes.
There are legitimate methods for destruction of documents and ones that are less than ideal. So this isn't a matter of just tearing a document in half. You know, they should be cross-shredded if we're talking about paper documents. Now, those of you from BC Cancer who are on this webinar and thinking, we don't have an SOP for destruction. You're right, we don't. There is a very good reason why. Regardless of what regulations the sponsor or the investigator instruct us to do, we, as deemed by the ministry, we must retain our documentation indefinitely. So at this point, we are not permitted to destroy anything. Hence, we have no procedure to do so.
Karen, thank you for bringing this up. Yeah, and it kind of circles back to what I mentioned at the very beginning, because all of this should be identified during the study setup. And if it is a sponsored study, yes, it should be in the contract, because there could be, in addition just to an overarching clinical trial regulations, there could be other legal or regulatory matters that would go contrary to what Health Canada mandates us to do. And of course, this should be considered. In addition, institutional policies may override some of the retention periods. So always do consult with the record management policies. Yeah, before anything is destroyed.
Yeah, and you're not supposed to take your boxes and dump them in the quality office and say these are ready for destruction. We've been having that happen. Gurm, you must have something you want to add to this.
Sure. Yeah. So I think much like as Karen said, bonfire in the parking lot, hitting delete on your keyboard is not an appropriate way to destruct data. Now, in the technology field, it's actually quite complex. And there are a lot of standards and ways you can go about it. It is not something that a research team should handle themselves, first and foremost. Check with your institution. In case of University of British Columbia, we do have UBC Destruction of Electronic Information Standard, and there's a lot of variation. Was the media encrypted, not encrypted, and just how much overwrite you need to do. If you look at an RCMP standard, it's 8-time overwrite. So it's not just deleting your writing data 8 times over the same space. In terms of the physical destruction, there is Government of Canada standards for IT media sanitation, which is what UBC encourages. If you are using a vendor, ensure that they are able to be compliant with a national standard to do so. And if they are, if a third party is doing destruction, then get a certificate of destruction from this vendor that outlines the method taken and the sort of clear sort of some of the issues you may have later, because I think we've heard stories in the news about finding a disk in a dumpster with a bunch of private data, and that does happen. So it's very important. Work with your IT teams locally. And if you're using a vendor, ensure that there is a certificate of destruction.
Okay, so I'm getting the message that if you're thinking about that the 15-year or the 25-year period is up, you should not even think about destroying it unless you've spoken with quality and IT. Yeah, okay. And as privacy officers, Tatiana and I, if we actually find a disk in a dumpster, we're always happier than if it's never found. Okay. Okay, I have one more really big area that I want to make sure for sure we cover off. Transfer of custody. What happens if there's a transfer of custody during the archive period? Tatiana, how about you? Want to try that one?
Okay.
Oh, some hard ones.
Again, a complex one. And the short answer is document. Document if it's known in advance or on a short notice. The first document to be made is, of course, the chain of custody, and ensure that there is everything is accounted for. The vendor that it's the receiving vendor knows when to expect it, and also very importantly, upon receipt, does a full quality check against the original master list or the storyboard, as Karen calls it, to ensure that everything's been received and it's been received in a condition that it's been sent. It's also very important to consider the method of transportation for the said documents. And again, vendor qualification also plays a big role to ensure that when it's transferred between the parties, the vendor who's receiving it is also qualified to be handling these materials as well.
I like the way you called them said documents. So said documents, they're moving around, and if they are unattended, let's call them unattended documents, you should probably have a chat with somebody to find out whose responsibility they are. It might be a department, it might be a division, it might be a center or program, it might be the institution, but somebody should always be responsible for even documents that don't seem to have a owner.
Yeah. Sorry, Karen, go ahead.
Sorry, I'll just jump in. If that particular trial was conducted under a CTA, the old sponsor and new sponsor must make sure that Health Canada was notified.
Yes. So at any point in time, even if it's discovered and they are unattended, they need to know. Okay. All right.
And
okay.
I think it's also important. Sorry, Jean.
No, go.
And somebody may disagree with me on that. But also delegation of responsibilities comes into play here within the site themselves, because we're accustomed to think, well, it's the responsibility of investigator to maintain the archive. But investigator may decide to appoint another person who will be the primary point of contact. To be contacted, as they will have, I'm sure, a bit more knowledge about what's in the boxes and how the vendor qualification went.
I think I'm going to feel a lot better about all this once it's all electronic and Gurm's in charge of it. Okay, we are going to now move into we have a little bit of time for some rapid fire questions. These are the ones where you get one or two short half a sentence phrases. Hopefully we can get through a bunch of the audience questions here, and then I have to cut it. Okay, so quick ones. Are there detailed processes for destruction after 25 or 15 years?
There should be. If your institution allows for that, they should be in your SOPs. And keep in mind that your sponsor, depending on what is happening with the product in question, they may tell you that you cannot archive. Something to keep in mind that the 15 years or the 25, these are minimums.
Yes, good point. Are the costs of archiving typically covered in site budgets negotiated at the start? What if costs change?
Well, they should be negotiated at the start. So yes, absolutely. Make sure that the costs are enrolled in the study budget. And if they do change, well, you kind of go back to the drawing table and renegotiate it with the sponsor. Usually they're very receptive. It is their study. I guess my worry more is for the investigators to be aware of these costs at the very beginning. So if you are a study coordinator or a research manager fielding this project, it's always a good idea to reach out to vendors available through your institution that have been vetted, reach out to procurement department, reach out to the document management teams, and ensure that you enroll this cost at the very beginning, so that at the end of the study, when the grant is almost near and done, you have enough funds available to retain these materials.
Okay.
Has anybody
rapid
had
question.
sorry, Jean. I was gonna say, has anybody had an investigator amendment come in to reduce to the 15 years? I have. They want their money back. They were trying to get a lower
Whoa.
already
Oh.
for 15 years. So put some inflation in there too.
All right. This one's definitely a Gurm question. You're on standby here. How do you handle digital media such as scans at the end of the study, discs sent in by the sponsor that contain CRF case report form data?
Good question. I think first and foremost, all electronic documentation related to the study should be part of your archive. And again, work with your local IT professional to, if you do happen to get a floppy disk in 2023, it's best idea to transfer that to a media that we can rely on for the future. And in most cases, and again, it's my personal opinion that moving to institutional storage away from physical media, where there's audit controls on that data set for future is the best idea. So work with your local staff.
Us quality and regulatory people, we love that audit control. It's okay. Okay, a couple more rapid fire ones. Do sponsors of a trial need to file individual sites copies of CVs, licenses, and GCP training in their TMF?
You bet. It is required by ICH. The sponsors do need to maintain the documentation to demonstrate that the trial staff that worked on their trial had the education, training, and experience to be able to participate on the trial. We keep talking, I'm going to just jump back. We keep talking and joking about floppy disks. Gurm, do IT departments or does your IT department actually maintain a machine that can read those things?
We do not. And I'm not aware of many institutions that do. So I think this is where transfer of media, especially older technologies, done so in a sanctioned, proper way, is appropriate. We are seeing that, the cloud storage, I think in the next 2 years, we're going to see is significantly coming down in terms of deep archiving. It's getting down to like $20 a terabyte for a year. So I think that's where we're heading. So it's going to be harder and harder to find those floppy disk drives. They do exist. You can purchase them. There are vendors that provide them, but of course you have to pay a significant premium to purchase that at this time.
Might have one in my garage, Durham. Okay, out there with the bonfire stuff. Okay, does the audit trail as part of an EDC system need to be archived? Gurm?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, you gonna say that with an exclamation mark? Right. Okay, I can take a couple more quick ones. At what point may the unblinded pharmacy binder be archived with the site blinded documents being sent to Iron Mountain? Ooh, that's a fun one.
Always fun. Check with your sponsor on that. Generally speaking, the trial as a whole needs to be unblinded before the documentation can mix and mingle.
Okay, I like that mix and mingle. I hope all you guys in the audience taking notes got that mix and mingle. Okay, financial records question. Should all paper records be archived for clinical trial with the other study documents?
Maybe I'll take this one. Yes, financials, SOPs, some of the other supporting documents, they don't necessarily need to go with your clinical trial documents that support the story of a trial itself. These are typically archived and maintained separately, and you should consult with, again, institutional policies on maintaining those supportive documents. And it's the institutional policies that will mandate the retention period as well as destruction, who is responsible, how do you do that?
Okay, another rapid fire one. Thank you. What do you do with the study files where I think they meant QI has retired and the study in last patient last visit date is unknown? Ooh, that's a good one. Tara?
Just do your investigative work. I mean, a lot of this is investigational. We're taking on a lot of other people's work are unknowns. Things were not clearly contented or defined. When we start trials, we didn't think about the end of them at the beginning. Now we are, because we're coming to fruition of a lot of these trials and retention. But yeah, do your investigative work, reach out to your REB. Perhaps you have that last, documentation there. See if somebody who worked as a co-I on the study might know some details, might have some content.
Okay, so that's a lot of information. Now I'm going to give you each 30 seconds, not any longer than that, just to do a rapid fire. Your last thing you want to say to this group on archiving, your last word. Start with Gurm. Last thing you want to impart.
I think what I would say is make sure you're consulting at the earliest stage when you're contemplating a clinical trial or you have approval. Work with your IT staff in ensuring they are aware of the requirements and they work with you in ensuring that throughout the life cycle of the project, including archiving, that you have support and all of the proper controls that are required to ensure that the institution meets compliance.
Wonderful. Tara.
I want to say dedicate two things. Dedicate your time after this to take some notes and to improve your process. Dedicate one person, if you can, to organize and manage your content.
Great. Karen.
Make sure your archive can adequately reconstruct what happened during the trial. If it's not clear through the ISF and the subject source documents itself, think about a storyboard.
Excellent answer. And Tatiana.
Yes, document, and document. If it's not documented, it didn't happen. So ensure you live by this principle and plan for it at the very beginning, and of course, try to negotiate a good amount of money to support the archiving activities at the very beginning.
Okay, I'd like to thank all of our viewing audience for your presence and for your participation today. And we just loved your questions, and I hope we got most of them incorporated into this episode. I think you received a rather thorough and expert answers. And to the Ask Us question today, which is what do we need to know about archiving? Apparently a lot. What I got out of it is ask before you archive. Okay. I'd also like to thank our guests today. You're very much appreciated, your time, your expertise, and your apparent enthusiasm for clinical trials and archiving. I'd like to also send out a special shout out to Tess Toper. She's the QA designate and education rep at Interior Health. She was meant to be one of the panelists today, but she was key involved in the theme, the case studies, and the question composition. Thank you to Tess, who couldn't be here. And I'd like to also bring to your attention that we have previous episodes from this season, and of course from season 1 and 2, and they're currently posted on the Clinical Trial BC website, and we will pull them if things become obsolete or take them out of the archive. And thank you again to our producer, Nando, the Communications and Education Coordinator at Clinical Trials BC. Nan, a few words from you.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today. I hope you enjoy the sections. And just before we close, I would like to go over some housekeeping stuff. So the sections today was recorded. The recording will be sent to your email and uploaded to our website. We will also send you an evaluation survey. The results of the survey will help us evaluate the section today and inform us for our future programs like this. We do have another episode scheduled for the beginning of April, on April 6th, with the topics is about promoting ethical designs and data integrity. More details and more episodes gonna come soon. So make sure that you are connected with us on our social media. We are on Twitter and LinkedIn. If you have any questions, please send us an email to clinicaltrialsbc@harrisbc.ca. You can also subscribe to our newsletters to get in touch with us and to receive the latest information, news, and upcoming events for the clinical trials community in British Columbia. That's
Okay.
it. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us today, everybody.
Thank you for having us.